So I'll just share my screen and try and bring you up. Spend 5 or 10 minutes just giving a bit more background about Homes for Cathy, and then we'll move on to the speakers. So hopefully you can see the screen okay, and there's a reminder of the hashtag on there. So Homes for Cathy, formed back in 2016. Towards the end of that year, there was the 50th anniversary of the Cathy Come Home Ken Loach documentary that had a massive impact, I understand, way back there in the 60s. And a number of housing associations, BCHA was coming towards its 50th anniversary. BCHA was formed in 1968 to meet housing need, and very much was voluntarily led for a long, long time until the 90s when it started to employ some people. But along with a number of other organisations came together to see what we can do. I guess it's quite sad, isn't it, that there is still a lot of housing need and much to do. As you see there, it's over 100 housing associations, local authorities and charities, and there will be opportunity for you to maybe sign up and join in with the sort of campaign that we're doing. Partners very much with Crisis, and we developed 9 commitments to lobby and try and influence. And Crisis published their big homelessness work a little while ago, didn't they? And at the same time, the Homes for Cathy came together. And so there's a lot of common theme. And of course, we've seen more recently, haven't we, during this last 12 months, a real big focus around ending homelessness, which is great, isn't it? But Homes for Cathy is very much also targeting within those larger housing associations to make sure that we can influence the providers of housing to do a bit more. So there's been a range of national events and workshops. Obviously I had to cancel last year's one, and we won't be having one this March for the time being, but it was a good opportunity for people to come together. And Homes for Cathy seems to be having, filling a little niche that may be missing, because sometimes you may think there's sort of too many organisations out there like that are doing this work, but it does seem to have managed to get some influence into MHCLG and other areas, and works very closely with the National Housing Federation and Crisis, as we say, and links in with Shelter as well. So just trying to pull a few of those things together and influence where we can. And very importantly as well, I think the thing that gets lost sometimes is demonstrating social impact and the social value of housing associations and the charitable sector involved in housing and homelessness. So commitments tied in with the plan to end homelessness with Crisis. They're aspirational, we're realistic. None of us could probably immediately say we're doing everything of those 9 commitments, but it is about being aspirational, isn't it? I think for those of us, whenever we're working with our customers, we're trying to help people set aspirational goals as to what's possible, even if you're in the middle of crisis. And I'm sure we're all aware of that. We've all probably encountered some challenges in our lives as well. And we know what's possible for everyone to achieve, don't we? So certainly looking at a lot of housing management issues, allocations, tenancy support, trying to get more priority for people on homelessness registers, and not just rely on a few organisations who will take people that no one else is willing to work with. Because we've all seen, I'm sure, the possibilities and the great outcomes that are achieved by giving someone a home and putting a bit of time in to help support and help someone move forward in their life. And of course, there is that whole issue, isn't there, of migrant homelessness, no recourse to public funds, and still an issue. And we need to learn from each other, don't we? We need to learn from organisations that have found ways and means to do that, or to commit some of our own funds to try and help people in those situations, particularly when people have lost their jobs in the pandemic. It's been a bigger issue, hasn't it? Where people are able to keep their homes, but not once they lose their employment. So here's the 9 commitments. I won't read them all out. They're there, they're on the website. Do take a look at them. We're focusing on those middle 3, sorry, number 4, not to make any takings seeking to prevent their homelessness homeless, to commit to meeting the needs of vulnerable tenant groups, and to work in partnership to provide a range of affordable housing options which meet the needs of all homeless people in their local communities. And that's what it's about. A good thing, really, isn't it, has been this stay on evictions, because it's made all of us think a bit harder about how we can engage more with our tenants, with our customers, to help them keep on top of their rent, or to deal with antisocial behaviour or neighbourhood issues. And it's amazing what's been achieved, isn't it, by organisations who are housing people. And we need to hope that keeps going, and then we don't have a massive problem in a few months' time when that stay on evictions happens. And all the good work of ending homelessness and helping people, rough sleepers particularly more recently, doesn't go to waste. So the latest campaign that Homes for Cathy is really focusing on follows on from the South Social Housing White Paper. And if any of you have looked through that, homelessness hardly gets a mention. If you try and do a word count on homelessness, I think it certainly doesn't even count up to one hand. And so certainly David Bogle, who sort of chairs really and has been the main driver, the chief exec of Hightown Housing, has very much been able to put that in the agenda, speaking both to the regulators and to government, along with some of the rest of us from Homes for Cathy, to try and see how we can get, if they're going to be bringing in some measures, I prefer that word to KPIs, but you know what I mean. It's about, so we are accountable, aren't we? I think it is important that we demonstrate the success of the work we do, but it's having, as they say, the right measures, isn't it, in place. But so that's certainly feedback that Homes for Cathy is going to really campaign and lobby on, and try and get as many other people backing that. So anything you can do to feedback to consultations on those things. Of course, the more people that do that, the more we can achieve. And as you see on there, really, the social housing regulator is very much, and many of us know that, so they've been sort of ahead of the game, haven't they, even well before the pandemic, around homelessness and the priorities and rough sleeping. And they very much, the regulator there monitors the work of housing associations in working with people who are homeless. So it could make a big difference with many housing associations who maybe are not delivering, and that's the reality, isn't it? You know, and that's an important thing that we all remember. So hopefully that just gives you a flavour for Homes for Cathy and who we are, and the purpose for today. And hopefully we can keep engaged over the months ahead, so that we can really boost that campaigning as well as the sharing and the learning. Right, so time now to come to our first guest speaker, and really pleased to that we've got Gary Wallace, who is public health specialist at Plymouth City Council, working for the Office of the Director of Public Health, and BCHA has had quite a bit of involvement with Gary, and the whole Plymouth Alliance work that has gone on down in that area, very much bringing together commissioning and delivery of services to help people with complex needs and multiple vulnerabilities, and joining up a whole load of organisations, and Gary will go into that. So we'll hand over to Gary. I'm told, Gary, that if we do start to overrun, I've got to somehow interrupt. I was going to try and get a bell, but I haven't got one. So, but I may give a 2-minute warning, if that's okay, so we can try and keep to time. But
please make
over
a bell
to Gary,
noise,
and look forward to what you've got to say.
Please make a bell noise. Right, I'm going to try and share my screen. Where are we? It's going to be one of those. scrambling around trying to find the thing. There we go. I can't find it. Oh, here we are. Okay. So I noticed that there are people from the Alliance here, and it would be nice for me to see them. I haven't seen them for some time because of plague. But so the first thing to say before I go into this is the Alliance for Complex Needs is a 10-year project, and we're 2 years in, and we've kind of been robbed of a year by plague. So it's very much a work in progress. Just some acknowledgements. I won't read these, but because the thing's going to be available to you afterwards. But just to say that Plymouth City is an integrated commissioning team. So all of the CCG monies for the Western locality, all of the council's money, all of the public health grant is legally pooled into a single 638 million budget. So 462 million of that is legally pooled. The rest is aligned. So there are some monies you can't legally pool. And there are risk share agreements between the participants in that. And there are a number of projects. So that the Alliance is just one of a number of projects where essentially we're bringing things together in an integrated way. And these are some of those. So the Alliance for Complex Needs is the first, really, because that really started in, well, the genesis of it was in 2012, but it kind of really started to gather pace in about 2014, 15. But there are huge projects that I'm involved in around parks and the sea, how the council becomes a curator of those places. There's some work around asylum seekers and refugees, children who are morbidly obese. That essentially means children that are so obese they're at risk of dying. And that there are a number of other projects around giving away, or the impact is giving away vapes, but the principle is fundamentally reviewing health improvement services. There's another project around chronic pain and distress, so that's kind of pain clinics. And also we've used a lot of the techniques we learned as we were putting together the Alliance, we've been using throughout COVID around compliance, the impact on people's lives. So we've spoken to about 300 or 400 people using appreciative inquiry, which was something we began using when we were putting the Alliance together. The other thing to say is that everybody focuses on the contract when I talk about this, the structure, if you like. So while structure is important, this is a cultural project. Culture eats structure for breakfast, and most of what we're trying to do in this is about building a new inclusive culture. So just a quick word on Alliance. It's essentially a legal partnership where people pool their sovereignty, a bit like the EU, where everyone pools their sovereignty, but they retain their independence, so they don't become a super state. It's not about mergers, it's about pooled sovereignty. So a typical contract would look like that on the left, an old style contract. In fact, there'd probably be 2 or 3 commissioners commissioning those services. And an Alliance contract looks like this. So essentially, the Alliance leadership team is comprised of the 7 CEOs that signed the contract. There are more providers, over 20 providers involved in the Alliance, but they don't all sign the contract. 7 CEOs signed the contract, and there are 3 commissioners from the council who join that Alliance leadership team. And its decision making is 1 person, 1 vote, and it's on the basis of unanimity. It's possible for providers to outvote the commissioners, and they regularly do. And then we have a thing called an owning commissioner, who's the person outside that box. And their role isn't to performance manage in the sense that you've all experienced performance management in the past. Their role is to essentially problem solve for the Alliance, particularly where it meets other systems that are perhaps causing problems within the Complex Needs Alliance. I won't go through those, I'll leave those to you. So the kind of genesis of this is we did a huge amount of co-production, and we spoke to around 900 people over kind of 4 years. in a variety of ways. And what we found essentially was that the way we were commissioning was acting as a problem setter. It was linear, it happened with little or no reference to other systems. It was very much a master-servant relationship. That markets and competition had essentially driven out cooperation. But that also has an important cultural impact on services. What it does is it makes services focus on the differences between them and other services, rather than the wealth of similarities. So often in the old world, services were obsessed with this tiny little difference they had with the service down the road and forgot actually how remarkably similar they were to the service down the road. But also the way services were delivered tended to be not asset-based. It infantilized system users. They did things to system users rather than with them, but it also infantilizes staff, which I'll come on to in a bit. And essentially lots of practice becomes routinized. So if the money is dished out in a way where you have to introduce thresholds, which are essentially about managing finance as much as managing people, many of the conversations people have with people in systems is about assessing where they are in relation to a threshold. You know, if these things, then package A, if those things, then package B. And really highly skilled staff were not really having permission to deploy the full range of their training and experience. Thresholds essentially began to act as barriers to access, and there are certain diagnostic labels which are essentially diagnoses of exclusion. And I'm sure you can all think of those, some of the personality disorder. Essentially, if you get labeled with that, you know, no one will work with you. But what the sum of this means is that no one service is able to respond inclusively to complexity. If you think about our typical clients, they have 3 or 4 things all at once, all of the time, and no single service. No, you know, let's say a drug agency, well, they would deal with the drugs, but maybe not the mental health and the offending and the you know, all the other kind of issues the person has. And there's also, we found this kind of mismatch. We think this is also driven by competition about what workers value and what system users value about their work. What system users value in their worker are things like warmth, authenticity, persistence, non-judgmentalism. Often when you ask workers, the first thing they talk about is a particular specialist skill. And since 2012, I've spoken to hundreds of people and I asked them, why did you improve? And they never say it was the multi-systemic family therapy. They always talk about a worker who was warm and persistent and welcoming, and those kind of things. So as a result of all this work we did, our kind of understandings are these, that proxy targets, these things that we're all forced to work to by government, essentially the only thing, I mean, the research is overwhelming. Part of my life, but I do academic stuff. There really isn't any research anywhere that says it makes anything better for anybody. In fact, they say it makes it worse for everybody. And that's not, you know, that's fairly easy to understand. They bear little or no relationship to the lived experience of the people we work with. The way we did commissioning practice, it drove out cooperation. The thing we all know you need if you're going to work with highly complex people is a really kind of cooperative and inclusive approach. And we were driving that out because, you know, why would you cooperate with the service down the road if in 2 years' time I make you fight over an ever diminishing pool of money? The other recognition is that if you think about the natural history of people's relationship with services, the way they leave services is really hard to understand. So it seems to be this incremental accretion of things over years, which suddenly enable people to leave services. So we would particularly talk about outcomes, but actually most services can't deliver outcomes because people are too complex and they're too specialized. The best they can deliver are outputs. And as I've said before, much of the practice in services kind of became routinized. So our kind of task is to incentivize cooperation, develop ways of including everybody in systems, so it's not necessarily hierarchical. And actually our challenge as commissioners is to understand value rather than targets. And the kind of key assets for us in that are experimentation, thoughtfulness, and learning. You can sum up that stuff around targets with these. So one of these is an economist, and the other is a sociologist. I can't remember which way round. But essentially, if you set proxy targets, you guarantee you're going to create gaming. So our kind of beginning question for our kind of journey, if I can call it that, it was this: in an ideal world, what would the system for people with complex needs look like from the perspective of system users, and how would we know? So one of the things is the services we have now were never designed. They just grew like Topsy. And I'm sure you would agree that if you sat down with a blank sheet of paper and all of the money, you wouldn't draw what we have now. So this is about taking time to step back and to say, what would we draw if we were able to draw it from scratch? And the way we did that is through a number of events and workshops. We did loads of field work, so hundreds of appreciative inquiries with everybody, with each other, with staff, with decision makers, with politicians, with people that use services, with their relatives. We offered loads of learning labs for people so that they could. So just to be clear, we did a year of system leadership work. All of the commissioners, 5 commissioners, and over 20 services. And this was kind of our method. And so what you're trying to do is you're not just gathering data. By working together, you're also building empathy, insight, and understanding for everybody in the system. As commissioners, we kind of had a naive assumption that all services knew each other, and actually nothing could have been further from the truth. And then reaching an agreement in alliance. So I'm often asked about this. How do you, if you've got no big stick making you do stuff, how do you decide? And I'm sure some of the members of the alliance that are here will relate to this, that essentially it's about relentless iterative discussion. So you start from a place where you build lots of empathy and relationships and trust between each other. And that's really about exploring why we come to work, and what you find is everybody is really motivated to do this. Everyone wants to do good. And once you understand that, it becomes very hard to demonize a person that disagrees with you, because they want the same thing as you. And you just have to really talk it through. And that can mean hard decisions take a long time. But generally, when the decision is reached, it's a better decision than if someone with a big stick had just said, this is what you'll do. We constantly refer back to fieldwork. In fact, we're constantly doing fieldwork. So we've just done another round of teaching people to do appreciative inquiry, and they're off doing that as we speak. A lot of this is about identifying the cultural differences between agencies that we need to work on. And then the typical thing is to identify prototypes to test ideas. So we call them prototypes or experiments. We don't call them, what's the other P word, projects, because the history of that is you spend 6 months trying to eliminate any risk to a pilot. And by the time you've done that, the moment has passed. Part of what the Alliance is trying to do is to be much more flexible and fleet of foot. So it's a really fast process to identify a prototype and go and try it. Some of the principles around experimentation, which, as I say, is a constant process. Good ideas are not an artifact of hierarchy. Anybody can have one. New public management tends to infantilize staff. So you might have a public-facing worker with a doctorate who is treated like like a robot by their manager. There's no room for that person to display their kind of breadth of knowledge and experience, and there's often no room for them to feed into how the services should be shaped. And actually, we're trying to turn that on its head, and we want to encourage everybody to try things, because we know once you get into that habit, it becomes infectious. And the way we do that is, as I said, with experiments, is to have minimal governance. So the 2 questions I ask people is this legal and is it safe? And if the answer to that is yes, then you can try something. The only thing we insist on is that you gather the learning. And in our world of complex adaptive systems, there's no good and bad learning, there's just learning. and you in the light of your learning, you tweak what you're doing and try and embed what's worked well. But because systems are constantly changing, ideas about best practice or lift and shift are nonsense. You know, there are things we were doing a year ago which we thought were really brilliant, and then COVID happened and they become deadly dangerous. And that, you know, that's a kind of big scale example of what's happening all the time. So we've all seen, you know, let's say we have a really great project, it's working really, really well, and then suddenly the rules to a universal credit change and it becomes, you know, terrible. So it's about constantly taking the temperature of the system. Another kind of thing to emphasize, as I've said before, is almost all the issues we encounter are cultural rather than structural. You know, a traditional management approach when something's not working is to invent a new structure, and then not be surprised, you know, then be surprised that it hasn't worked. So we only invent new structures that support culture change. The two particular ones are the Creative Solutions Forum and the System Optimization Group. So the Creative Solutions Forum is a kind of practice forum where people can experiment with ways of working together on really complex cases. And almost everything we do is about building new culture together. We're trying to build empathy between actors in systems. That's been very difficult during COVID because it's really best done face to face. But also as a management team, we try to reframe problems in a positive light. So we wouldn't say, oh, this person is really resistant to change. What we would say is these people are really highly affiliated to their service. Our role as leaders is to build new affiliations, bigger affiliations. And the way you do that is by engaging people. And there's a guy in Gateshead, Mark Smith, who's doing similar work. And he has a phrase which I kind of agree with, which is that we don't need new public servants, we need new public services. Just a bit of necessary stuff. This takes a long time. You have to prioritize it. People would say in the beginning, I've got a day job, and now they would say, well, actually, this is my day job. You do sometimes need independent assistance, and if you do, then don't be embarrassed about guessing it. We can all learn from other people. It can be very wearing, kind of long, mutually supportive challenge. Can be very wearing. You just have to kind of be persistent. But if you build enough trust and understanding, it's possible to do that in a way which people don't feel it personally. And it's important to ignore hierarchy. And I don't really mean, ignore your trustees, but what I mean is appreciate that everyone that works in your service has something to say, and it's your job as a manager or a leader to give them the opportunity to say it. So some of the impacts. So we've lost money from the system. This is not a deliberate thing. We had no choice about this, but we're actually caring for more people than we were before. We saved a lot of money in the bed and breakfast budget, particularly before COVID, and even more in supervised consumption during COVID. As Martin mentioned in the Everyone In, I mean, I think it really kind of blew the gaff for the government that it actually is possible to house. It is possible to house roofless people if you really concentrate on it. And we did that with very low churn during the lockdowns. Abolished staged approaches to housing, and it's a much more kind of bespoke approach right across the system. During COVID, I believe shifting stuff online has reduced, I'm told, has reduced DNA rates significantly, did not attend rates. We also managed to give away what is now over 300 vapes to people with lung disease who are in a complex needs system. And also we set up a managed alcohol project where we bought alcohol for people and gave them it throughout the day. A low dose, and there was no drunkenness, and the police reported huge reductions in antisocial behaviour and aggressive begging and those kinds of things. We haven't had any outbreaks. I mean, touch wood. Some of that is luck, but a lot of that is down to the excellent practice of our staff. Some services report reductions in long-term sickness in staff who feel more kind of part of the system now. There's kind of huge increases in co-location of staff and integrated approaches, little of which came from the top. So quite a lot of this was just staff recognizing they can do things better if they sit next to each other. lot of routinized governance across the system has been removed. I mean, COVID really exposed how much work in the system has got nothing to do with people that use the system. It's all to do with the needs of services. And lots of the work is becoming more kind of peripatetic. So taking the service to the person rather than expecting them to come to us. But some of the results of that is we probably need, going forward, fewer buildings because there's so much sharing of buildings. And I'd say, I'm sure others would agree that are in the seminar, that's kind of fundamentally changed all of us. And it's basically the key lesson for us, people that are in a management role is the recognition that we have to focus on leadership, not on management. It's not about getting people to manage to targets. It's about providing leadership, creating learning environments and learning cultures for our amazing staff, really, and to create the space for them to be amazing, to do amazing things. And the really kind of key thing is it's you know, if you read a typical tender document, it will use the language of business and it will use the language of targets and all of that, and you will rarely find the language, our language, as I would call it, the language of service and duty and kindness and empathy and openness and trust. And they're all kind of words that values that we have placed front and center in a very kind of unashamed way. Here, that's the end. Stop sharing.
Thanks.
I beat you. I beat the bell, Martin. I beat the bell.
Yeah, well, you know, I was just about to put a bell through on my phone, actually. So I picked it up just to send you an alarm because I thought that might be the most polite way to interrupt. But no, thank you. That's good. It's a taster, and obviously BCHA is involved in that alliance as well. And so I know of the challenges from the provider point of view, but we've got an excellent team in Plymouth, and it has worked really well. And it seems to us, and people work out solutions because they're very customer focused. And I like the point you made, Gary, that all learning is good, isn't it? You know, even when things don't work, we learn from things that don't work. Probably learn more, don't we, I guess. So there was one little question that just came in from Daniel, just asking earlier on in your presentation, what do you mean by output?
So if you think about building an aeroplane, if you build the entire aeroplane, that's an outcome. If you build a wing, that's an output. Does that kind of explain it?
Yeah. Well, yes, hopefully. Anyone's got any other comments?
So the point in relation to complex needs services, the point of that is it is unreasonable to expect say a housing service to solve all of a person's problems so that they can completely leave a system. It's ludicrous. A drug service can't do it, a housing service can't do it, mental health service can't do it, because people have complex problems that are all interrelated and they have them all the time. And you know, a lot of our people have 4 or 5 key workers in 4 or 5 services, and in areas other than Plymouth, they probably never speak to each other, and they're all kind of pulling in different directions, and the person's pushed from pillar to post, and yet they're all charged with their commissioners with achieving the person leaving the service. And actually, a lot of this is about recognizing that there's a natural history to a lot of this. That's what the research tells us, and it's about walking alongside people and helping them live the wellest life they can, and kind of chipping in with useful skills, useful learning that they can over years build on until they can eventually leave a system.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Gary. And I assume people can contact you if they want to have any more update, and hopefully there's a few on here that might want to explore a bit more, because yeah, I do think it's something that would be really good to roll out to more and more areas to try and just improve value for money as well as quality of service. And I think you showed us slides that showed us both there, didn't we? And we can find solutions. Thank you very much.
Martin, can I just make one quick final point?
Go on.
Which is that the target, the focus should be to listen relentlessly to the person in front of you and do what they ask for. And what we find is if you do that, everything else that commissioners worry about, the unplanned care, bed and breakfast, ED, blue lights, they all go down, you know, and support is a very cheap intervention, but it was driven out by this idea that everyone needs to be cured. It's not about that. It's about support is cheap. Support is a very human thing, and people in our systems really, really value it.
Yeah. Yes, and I think on your last slide you talked about that focus on kindness, empathy, and concern, and you get that response back, don't you? So, yeah, no, thanks very much for that, Gary. Appreciate your time and all you've put into this whole issue of disrupting the commissioning process, as I see it, positively, and getting some great outcomes. So, thank you very much. So now you're going to move on to another critical, very, very important issue, isn't it? Domestic abuse. We've seen increases in that during the lockdown, and continues to be something that we need to be very proactive in engaging and finding solutions. So very pleased to welcome Judith Vickress from Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and doing some really, really great work. The Alliance was launched in 2014 and is having greater influence and great benefit for all of us, isn't it? Is the expertise and knowledge and specialist knowledge that's available if only we want to get involved and ask. And I think that's a key thing, isn't it? So, and Judith has got a great deal of experience working in this area and works as a development manager. So over to you, Judith. Just unmute.
Yeah, classic. And it's not usually me on mute, I tell you. But I will definitely need that bell, because anybody who does know me on here knows that I could talk about this all day. So, so please do shut me up when necessary. I'm going to try and share my screen right now. Like Gary, I seem to have everything and its wife up. Right, show more windows. This is what my training sessions are like. Me just yabbering. Okay, so can you see that? What are you seeing the notes, or can you see the full slide or the note slide?
We're seeing the notes.
Okay, swap presenter. Brilliant. So yeah, thank you very much. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I don't really know honestly how to follow Gary, because that was all, and I've put it in the chat there, that was absolute music to my ears. And I had the benefit of talking to a colleague in Plymouth yesterday. So I've been almost kind of hyperventilating over the Alliance ever since. So, and I think you'll see why when I go through the presentation, because it just exactly fits with what we talk about as well. But just to introduce myself, just very briefly, so yeah, Judith Vickress. I work as the National Development Manager for DAHA. So I work with providers and local authorities outside of London, effectively, because we've got another London Development Manager, to access the support that we can give to work towards DAHA accreditation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But I've been with DAHA for about 18 months, but previously worked in a national organisation that actually, you know, specialising in multi-agency working and working in areas to try and achieve effectively what Plymouth have achieved. So it's really exciting to see that level of work happening there. And, you know, previously to that, I've been in the domestic abuse sector for about 20 odd years. You know, too long really, but so my background is in domestic abuse as opposed to housing, but it's just been an absolute pleasure to move over into this sector and see how dedicated the sector is to working with us to end domestic abuse. And you know, one thing that we can demonstrate is how pivotal housing is in that sort of societal change and in attitude towards domestic abuse. So a talk through that. But just I work with an organisation called Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. That's where DAHA is a project that's hosted by Standing Together. Standing Together pioneered the coordinated community response to domestic abuse. So it again is kind of fitting with what Gary was talking about with the Alliance. What we know is that no single agency can possibly see the picture, the full picture of a person who is living with domestic abuse and the intersectionality of that person. So thinking about everything with domestic, and the coordinated community response has been seen as good practice for many years, but I think probably as Plymouth have found, and speaking to somebody yesterday when they started talking about this in 2012, it does take a long time. It takes a big commitment. It takes everything that Gary has described, and that takes time, and it is a culture shift. And achieving a positive culture shift is not easy, and it does take time. So we know that most public services are not designed with domestic abuse or violence against women and girls particularly in mind, and they often struggle to protect people. So poor communication and gaps between services put survivors at risk. And that's one of the key things we see through domestic homicide reviews particularly, is that lack of quality information sharing, quality risk identification and quality assessment of the risk. And that needs to change. And then we know that having a coordinated community response will change that, preventing working in silos. So, you know, having worked in national roles for 8 years, I have seen that the pockets of silo working still happening, and to the detriment of survivors and service users. So, and you know, again, a big issue that we've recognised over the years is that lack of strategic commissioning around services, and that sort of, you know, battling, if you like, for pots of funding that automatically is going to create issues in terms of competition, which ultimately don't benefit survivors or service users that we're trying to help. So everything that I'm going to whiz through this PowerPoint a little bit, just simply because there's a couple of areas I really want to focus on. Obviously, I'll talk about DAHA, but I want to be really sort of helping us think a bit more about that prevention of homelessness, and in particular thinking about how we provide move-on accommodation for survivors of domestic abuse, but also where we place our minds in terms of what we're doing around the perpetrators of domestic abuse, and it all fits in with this coordinated community response. So domestic abuse is often a hidden crime, considered to be a hidden crime, often described as being hidden behind closed doors. What we know, and I think what we've really demonstrated in DAHA and in the whole housing approach, is that it isn't hidden, we're just not seeing it. And I think if we change that narrative, flip that narrative around to looking for domestic abuse, we will see it. And that's a lot of the work that we do in DAHA when we talk to people about what it's, you know, whether they want to go for accreditation, is actually finding out, you know, how are you looking for domestic abuse? Domestic abuse is so prevalent. You know, we know that over 2 million people a year do experience domestic abuse. You know, 1 in 3 women are experiencing domestic abuse. It is so rife is a word I use. It's probably not the best word, but it's so rife that actually if we adopt a domestic abuse lens, then we will see it. And I think what has happened over the years, particularly outside of the domestic abuse sector is that we're not looking, and we're not seeing, and we're not asking, we're not listening, and because we don't want to deal with it necessarily. So we need to be opening these doors in a literal and metaphorical sense, and making sure that we actually see what is going on. And that's what DAHA accreditation is a lot about. So just kind of putting it into context, so domestic abuse and housing. So the emphasis is on women and children leaving their home for safety, while the abuser often remains in the property, consequence free. That is a complete shift in narrative that we're looking for when we talk about domestic abuse in housing. We need to start thinking about how we can make families and victims and survivors of domestic abuse safe in their own home. And that requires multi-agency working. So that requires that coordinated community response, because we need those other agencies who can work around that family to be thinking about what can we do to enable them to stay, and we've all got a part in that, but what can we do to ensure that they're safe by doing some work or rehousing or doing something with the perpetrator. One of the sort of key things I keep telling people is to, when they're challenged about, oh, she just needs to leave, is we need to put that question, why doesn't the abuse stop? And we need to prevent that abuse. We need to hold the perpetrator to account, which is the absolute core of the coordinated community response to domestic abuse, holding that perpetrator to account and enabling and empowering survivors of domestic abuse to have what they want, what they need. And often they're telling us they want to stay in their own home, but they feel like they're being pushed out. They're told they have to leave for their own safety, but actually they want to stay where they've made a home, where they have a community, where they have family support. So as agencies, as organisations, we need to listen to that, and we need to start enabling people to stay in their own home. In housing, we also know the emphasis is on refuge accommodation as the main housing option for women and children fleeing domestic abuse. Refuges aren't places that many women want to go to. They are still sometimes communal living, but they're also very insecure in terms of, they have a license to stay in the properties. So it's very short term, and it's not for everybody. And we need to be really listening to that as well, and making sure that we have alternatives to refuge, and that we also know that refuge are bursting at the seam, particularly now since COVID last year. We know that the refuge spaces have been an absolute premium. And there are issues with move on out of refuge because of the moratorium on moving, and making sure that people stay where they are. So we need to be thinking about how we can offer that alternative. So we know that the home isn't always a safe place for everybody to be, and you can't imagine what it's like to go home, perhaps if you've been at work, and think, I'm can turn this key and I don't actually know whether I'm going to be safe tonight, and that is a huge consideration when we think about domestic homicides either take place in the home or near the home, and so for many women and children, home is not safe. And we know that we're not just talking about social housing, that only 17% of households live in social housing, and we have a slightly larger in private rented, but a huge amount in owner occupation. So we need to be thinking about the whole tenure of housing when we're thinking about domestic abuse and responses. So I won't go into too much detail on the whole housing approach to domestic abuse. I've put a link on the last slides for everybody to access the full toolkits and reports. But the whole housing approach is endeavours to improve the housing options and outcomes so that every individual, regardless of their tenure and circumstances, and their identity and their access needs, and whatever their sort of position, their protected characteristics, that they have safe and stable housing. So a few weeks ago, before Christmas it was actually, we launched the Whole Housing Toolkit, and I would urge you to all have a look at that. I'll just very briefly show you what we're talking about when we're talking about the whole housing. So the light green circles are the types of tenure. So thinking about supported housing, social housing, private rented sector, privately owned, and refuge services as well. Thinking about some of these aren't permanent responses and answers to accommodation. So we need to be thinking about how we can ensure that everybody has access to permanent, more stable accommodation. But then the dark green circles are the initiatives and options to help survivors achieve and maintain safe and stable housing. So we're looking at Housing First, which I'll briefly talk about. Managed reciprocals, which you can find out more about on the, but it's effectively having an agreement, strategic agreement between areas or between districts to have a reciprocal arrangement between housing, and making sure that you kind of managing that in a really safe way. So we're talking about sanctuary schemes, that if somebody does want to stay safe in their own home, they can get more safety measures put in place so that they can stay in their home. Specialist domestic abuse services provision for housing, absolutely key. So having advocacy for survivors of domestic abuse, we've found makes the biggest difference in terms of them engaging with the wider coordinated community. And flexible funding. So this is just very briefly, it's a pot of funding that is used for any barriers to somebody leaving or being safe in their own home or being able to stay at home. And that could mean money for rent arrears. It could be money for having dog sitting, anything that enables somebody to stay in their own home. No questions asked. If you need that money, a few £100s, it's here. We'll give you very quick access to that money if it enables you to, and for us to prevent homelessness. So DAHA, Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, I'll talk about very quickly, and perpetrator management I'll also come to, because I think that's a really important and quite fast moving area nationally at the moment. So DAHA's mission, very simply, to improve the housing sector's response to domestic abuse, co-created in 2014 between a partnership of 3 organisations standing together, and Peabody, Large Housing Association in London, and Gen2 up in the North East. The idea is that we want to improve joined up working between housing, homelessness and domestic abuse sectors. We want to promote coordinated community response, and a way to do this is through the introduction and adoption of a set of standards. So those standards are based on 8 priority areas. So we're looking at policy and procedure, case management. We want everybody to have a policy around domestic abuse, and I think the social housing white paper actually will go a long way to supporting that. It's going to be something that the regulator is going to be looking at. But we want ones for the tenants, but we also want one for staff. It's really important to identify and acknowledge that many staff will be experiencing or have experienced domestic abuse, and they need to know that they're supported. So case management, looking at the culture and the attitude, the ethos around domestic abuse. We want to see that everybody who discloses domestic abuse will be believed. They will and that they need. We want to see that risk is managed. We want to look at inclusivity and accessibility, equality, diversity, making sure that everybody can access services and be treated in the the same way. Perpetrator management, which again I'll cover. Partnership working, absolutely key. The thread throughout DAHA accreditation is the coordinated community response. If we don't work in partnership, if we don't work, if we continue to work in silos, we're just not going to achieve anything. So it's a really important and key part of DAHA accreditation. We look at quality of training, making sure that every staff member has training in domestic abuse and has an awareness of domestic abuse. And then we look to see how well the organisation is publicising that they are holding perpetrators to account, that they are domestic abuse aware, and continually raising awareness of domestic abuse. The more we talk about domestic abuse publicly, loudly, the more people will feel able to disclose what they're experiencing, and we start opening those doors that have been closed. So just very briefly, just a couple of things that are going on with DAHA. So we host and facilitate 9 regional groups in England, and the purpose of those is to bring together housing and domestic abuse and homelessness. And they are fairly new, but evolving and growing, and they link very well to the National Housing Group Policy and Practice Group that has been running for about 3 years, and we have a direct link into the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office. So we're already taking issues that are happening regionally to central. Oh, is that the bell?
It's just a 1 minute warning. Yeah.
Oh, 1 minute. I'm right. Okay, right. Told you I'd need it. Good Lord. Right. So luckily, there's a lot attached in the last slide. So I'm not going to go into detailed Housing First, because I think a lot of you know about Housing First and you know what it's all about and how vital it is. And just to let you know that we're particularly interested in looking at Housing First for women, because there's so few available, and women are more likely to be the hidden homeless. We know that the biggest cause of homelessness for women is domestic abuse, so we need to be thinking about having that Housing First model and more of them, and dedicated projects to women. So we'll flick through so because these slides will be available, but I just wanted to really kind of emphasize the need for Move On. I have attached in the last slide a report, a recommendation report, improving the Move On pathway for survivors of domestic abuse. What we've seen, particularly through COVID, is that lack of move on has been a massive barrier to enabling people to leave the home who don't want to go into refuge, but also out of refuge. So we're seeing what we call bed blocking in refuge. That's coming through loud and strong, because there is no move on accommodation, or we're limited in accessing that accommodation for various reasons, because housing providers have not been able to create the availability there. And we need to be thinking about Move On. So I'd really urge you to have a read of that report, and the recommendations that we have in there, that we are working on. We need investment into this, and we're hoping to get that. But the big main issues, we want a national campaign building on the commitment and support gained through the Make a Stand pledge, and it's really important that housing providers think about how they can answer the call to increase move on property, whether that's through direct letters, and particularly with their local domestic abuse services, to see how they can help in terms of prioritising move on for survivors of domestic abuse, to free up the refuge spaces that are completely blocked at the moment, and how we can work together to do that. So I think it's really important that we have a think about how we look at that right now. And that's preventing homelessness, but also we need to be thinking very clearly, and I think this quote is really quite powerful from some work we did quite a few years ago, that the perpetrator is the problem, so why are we constantly moving survivors, or telling them they have to move, they have to change their whole lives in order to stay safe from domestic abuse? Why are we not focusing on that perpetrator? And I think that's a change in narrative and a change in thinking that we need to all have, we need to all adopt, and then we need to make sure that society starts thinking in this way. Like I say, the coordinated community response, we have to hold perpetrators to account. And one way of doing that is ensuring that we keep survivors safe in their own home. We work together to do that, and we move perpetrators. And just on that, so these are the links for the documents, but there is a subgroup of the perpetrator subgroup of the National Housing Group that we're just putting together now, and there is a call to action around perpetrators, a national for a call for a strategy around perpetrators, making sure that we are not evicting them into homelessness, but we are holding them to account, and we are providing some kind of requirement that if they keep a roof over their head, they engage with us and they start engaging in the services, and that we start to consider their intersectionality and thinking about what their needs are, how we meet their health needs, their mental health needs, their alcohol, drug dependencies, how we all work together to ensure that we're also working to improve the lives of those who perpetrate abuse as well. Because if we do that, we're taking away the opportunities and the chances of them reoffending in terms of domestic abuse, and we're keeping survivors safe. And that has to be the way that we move forward. Whatever we've done for the last 20 odd years, we're still seeing at the moment, around 3 women a week being murdered as a result of domestic abuse. That hasn't changed despite all the fantastic work that lots of people are doing. So we have to start changing the way we're thinking and moving it towards what are we doing about the perpetrator is actually one of the key things that we need, and housing have such an important role to play in that. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Judith. Yes, there's a lot more we could say on this as well. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, isn't it? Stay in your own home. You touched on that at the beginning and a bit later on. That actually, people end up having to flee and move out and then start new lives elsewhere. And I also believe, yes, a lot more workers an engagement to go on with perpetrators to prevent sort of further issues and to change, I think is something maybe that doesn't get enough investment. Yeah. So those 2 big points out of there. I mean, there's lots more, but I think those are particular ones that stood out for me. That's the things we don't always think about. Yeah. Just one very quick question, because we're slightly over time, but Lisa was just asking, are there any statistics out there for male domestic abuse?
Yeah, so I mean, the research around that, what we know is that a huge majority of the people, the victims who are killed as a result of domestic abuse are female, and the perpetrators of those homicides are male. So the ONS statistics tell us that 1.6 million women, that's 7.5% of women, experience domestic abuse, with 3.8% of men experiencing domestic abuse. So we do certainly need to create an environment that enables male victims to come forward, particularly from the LGBT community, because we're still struggling to get those disclosures. But the reality is, and every scrap of evidence points towards the fact that this is a gendered issue, and we need to maintain the focus around that, whilst obviously acknowledging that men do experience domestic abuse, and we do need to provide the right support services for them.
Okay, yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. And just a bit of a clarification on my job title. It's Head of Policy and Practice. Thankfully, I don't have 3 hats anymore, so no longer including the development side of it. But thank you so much. Really, really great to be here. I know that you talked briefly there about the Centre for Homelessness Impact, and thank you for letting everybody know the history of my kind of involvement in the sector as well. But just very quickly, I think it's useful to let everybody know just a wee bit more about who we are at the centre, just by way of adding that kind of context, setting the scene, before I kind of get on with what I'm here to talk about. So we were set up in 2018. We are a What Works centre, so we focus on what works. You know, our biggest challenge really is to end homelessness for good by focusing on the better use of evidence and data. So we work with policymakers at the national and local level, and practitioners, people delivering services on the ground, to improve the use of evidence and data, so that we're actually focusing our energy on actually what works and growing our understanding of the stuff that we're not so sure about in terms of the evidence yet. So I'm going to try and change my slide. Yeah. So very quickly, what do we mean by ending homelessness for good? So it's helpful to have a very clear definition of what that means. What that means is moving towards a society where any experience of homelessness that can't be prevented, it's only ever rare, it's brief, and it's non-recurring. So, and that is achievable. It's definitely achievable. There's no doubt about that. But we need to take a different view of the way that we're doing things. So we know that homelessness is very stubborn and it's extremely systemic. We know that. And thanks to the amazing efforts of the sector over the last 5 decades, we've really grown our understanding, especially of the causes of homelessness, in relation to housing supply, affordability, access, the welfare system, funding for support, all of these things. We know the importance of those things. And we also understand the role of poverty, for example. We know all of this. And there's often a mismatch between the resources available and the level of need. But actually, we still see the trends. When we make massive effort to bring those numbers down, the trend is it goes back up again, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up. We need to shift that so that we're making a sustainable reduction in those numbers. And in order to do that, we need to shift our kind of efforts towards focusing on what works at the intervention level. And that's where we have massive gaps in our knowledge. And we need to fill them. So that's what we do. We work with the sector to fill those gaps and actually make us more evidence informed in terms of the decisions that we're making. And in order to do that, we address 3 major challenges. I'm not going to go into these in any major detail, but very, very briefly, it's around making sure we've got good data, improving the data that we've got, and improving how we use that data. The second one there is making sure that the available evidence that we have is all in one place through our tools on our website, and making sure that we are using those tools to understand where the gaps are. So we're focusing our attention on filling in those gaps. And then the third is making sure that people delivering those services can act on the available evidence and data to actually develop and deliver services and test them, so that we're all taking part in a kind of test and learn approach. What I'm here to talk to you about today is very firmly in the second area of those challenges, filling in the gaps in the evidence. And we know that obviously during the current pandemic, there are going to be some challenges that require more urgent attention than others. And obviously with the health crisis and the ongoing economic fallout, employment is ripe for further consideration. The health crisis just adding to what is already a huge challenge. So what we need to do is we need to keep an eye on the future and thinking what we can be doing to mitigate the impact of the ongoing fallout of COVID on all of these brilliant efforts that are kind of being put in to tackle homelessness. So this is the specific challenge that we took the time to look at in our policy paper, and there is more detail, and I'm sure that we will share the link for everybody so that you can take a closer look at the policy paper in more detail. But just to pull some highlights out for you today. So we're looking at employment and homelessness in the context of a post-COVID economy. So not employment necessarily and employment support and homelessness as we know it, although that's where the evidence is drawn from, but we need to specifically think about it in the post-COVID economy. So all of, and I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't know here, all of the evidence suggests that good work improves health and well-being for nearly everyone. But evidence also suggests that work for people on the fringes of the labour market is often difficult to obtain. And for those who find employment, it might still be insecure and poorly paid. And we also know that even those who do manage to get a job, people can't plan for the future necessarily if they're on that low income and it's insecure. And that makes them extremely vulnerable to income shocks, placing them at huge risk of homelessness and future homelessness as well. And again, going back to the situation that we're talking about here, these situations existed before COVID, and COVID will be making those situations even worse and pushing more and more people closer and closer to homelessness and the risk of homelessness. So we know that the link between homelessness and employment is more complex than I don't want to oversimplify something that is complex, but it's not a secret that homelessness is actually very often the consequence of people not having sufficient financial resources to cover their housing costs. I mean, it's quite simple when you look at it that way, bearing in mind, obviously, the complexities behind it. So decent work, which is the fundamental basis of what we're talking about here, can offer significant protection against homelessness within that context. But on the other hand, even, and I, kind of repeating myself here, but just to make a point, those who are in employment aren't risk-free. The insecure nature of it, unreliable nature of it, with the 0 hours kind of contracts that are quite prevalent today, and that poor pay. And from a landlord perspective, obviously the way that universal credit is administered makes that even more of a challenge for people who are in, so just having a job, let's get to the point, just having a job doesn't remove all of those challenges and reduce those risks. And we also know, I realise I should have changed my slide quite a while ago, apologies. But we also know that, in reality, the majority, in fact, most people who are homeless don't have a job. Okay, we'll start from there. But we also know that the majority of those people actually do want to work. And that ranges from people across the spectrum, those who have recently lost employment, to those who are facing the biggest barriers. Some may be long-term unemployed, and actually some may never have actually worked. Now, this is evidenced by a number of studies, and it's actually evidenced by the experience of people working with people every day across the UK to try and help people into jobs. Now, in our policy paper, this particular piece of work, we look more closely at the evidence. We considered the barriers to employment, but mainly, and this is what I really want to kind of focus the rest of my presentation on, is we looked at what do we know works when it comes to providing employment support to prevent homelessness. So I suppose it's useful at this point to mention, and it won't surprise anyone, so the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact in terms of both health and economic security on those who were already experiencing disadvantage. So there were already people experiencing disadvantage because of the situation. And then as a kind of a pincer effect on the other side, those who experience homelessness will be facing the biggest barriers to employment and challenges that affect their prospects of employment. Just to name a few, support needs, we will all be very familiar with the main ones around mental health, physical health, substance use problems, offending history, a lack of peer support, discrimination. And actually, by simply not having a fixed address, that can cause a real problem. And things like lack of experience and actually a lack of confidence can really hold people back and make it more difficult for people to gain employment. And I'm not going to labour on the barriers. I think that we all know what the barriers are to some extent. But let's think about what we know actually works. So the good news is that we already have a lot of evidence to draw from. While a lot of it isn't from the UK context, and that is one of the issues, we need to build our understanding and our evidence base in the UK context. But considering what we do have and the bits that we do have available in our own kind of environment, we know especially that expert, tailored, individual advice is key to progress when it comes to aiming to support people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness into employment. And that is a real kind of key thing that comes through every time you look at the evidence. In fact, there's consistent evidence that a key ingredient of effective employment support for those who are long-term unemployed and face the most challenges is high quality personal advice, providing personalised, obviously, motivating support, intensive job preparation, job search and placement advice, and who work with small caseloads, and there's access to complementary support around that. To mention a specific evaluation from 2007, the DWP's review of the evidence, one of the strongest conclusions that came from that was that personal advisors are critical, to use their words, to the success or otherwise of interventions. So I think I've made it very clear that personal advice tailored is extremely important. And there's also something about flexibility given to advisors as well, and also the impact of conditionality, which has come up a lot in a lot of the kind of other debates around access to welfare assistance and stuff like that. And Housing First is a great example. That actually people who feel coerced into taking part in programs rather than taking part in something that actually meets their individual needs, that leads to motivation and engagement kind of being undermined and actually leads to dilutes the potential effect. And then another source of emerging evidence is the ongoing evaluation of the Building Better Opportunities programme, and that funds a range of projects, which I won't go into the ins and outs of, but that evaluation looks in detail at projects working with different groups in different parts of the country, but some common effective components of some of those services include trusted relationships, services provided in familiar places, that idea of taking services to people and to places where people feel familiar and comfortable, flexibility to provide bespoke and tailored provision, the inclusion of specialist partners, informal approaches, and active brokerage with employers is also a really interesting and important one, among many other things that came out in terms of effective approaches. Now, many local authorities, social landlords, third sector providers are going to be providing or commissioning services to help people into employment in some form or another, or to even increase income. So not necessarily just get a job, but to actually improve the jobs that people are in. In some cases, these may be specifically targeted to tackle homelessness, but in the main, from what we gather, a lot of those services are available to just vulnerable groups in general. There's no targeted or specific provision as a rule to specifically for preventing and tackling homelessness. So what we're recommending, I'm not going to labour on these points because I want to talk about something specifically, a particular intervention of promise, but our recommendations from that piece of work is about having specific employment pathways set within the statutory system for providing homelessness advice and support that should be supported and assisted by government. I completely understand that, you know, you stretched to the edges as it is, but actually setting those employment pathways up within the statutory system means that people get access to it very, very quickly. The focused support, there should be focused support on those who are facing homelessness or are homeless as a result of COVID related unemployment. That will help them get back into work as soon as possible and limit the damage that long-term unemployment and obviously homelessness can have. And then the third one, specific interventions focused on people who are furthest away from the labour market and who need that more intensive personalised support. And this is where I just want to very briefly talk to you about individual placement support, IPS. So it is an evidence-based approach. but it's not necessarily been provided within the context of homelessness. So just to give you a bit of background, it's a vocational intervention originally developed in the United States, and it targets individuals with significant barriers to work with customised long-term and integrated vocational and clinical services to help them gain and maintain competitive employment, and that's an important area. So similar to Housing First, it follows 8 principles, and the idea is that these principles are the things that make it work based on the evidence. The first one, zero exclusion. There's not an expectation that someone needs to be long-term homeless or have certain individual issues before they get access to it. Anybody who wants to participate actually can. There's an integration of mental health and vocational elements. So that's the external support plus the vocational support together. There's this thing about competitive employment as well. There's no expectation that people have to volunteer or go into some kind of like apprenticeship. It's actually helping them move into competitive employment. Benefits counselling, help to understand how to navigate the benefit system. Universal credit, that would be obviously much a given, and I understand that will probably be something very familiar to most of you. Rapid job search is a principle. It begins with 1 month. Within 1 month of the person actually joining, there's no expectation that someone has to be ready for a job before they start searching. And there is follow-on support, and it's there for as long as they need it, even after they go into employment. And the client gets some kind of agency. They're not forced or coerced into taking jobs that they don't feel would be best for them in the long term. And then there's job development. So there's brokerage in there. There's actually building up a network of employers who are working to take on people and provide those placements. And because of the positive results of that particular intervention, it's actually being rolled out across England by the NHS to work with people with mental health issues. So we think it's got real promise in the context of homelessness and homelessness prevention. So I'm going to finish up with this then, before hopefully we've got time for some questions. So we know that many organisations are already delivering employment-based interventions, but we now have a clearer picture of what is likely to work. So let me ask you this: what if we actually moved practice towards doing things differently based on actually what the evidence is telling us, instead of making assumptions about what works? And we've all been doing it. There's no judgment here. There's definitely an opportunity here to test something like IPS and really pathways and all of the things that I've mentioned today, and really grow our understanding of what works. And we can make a significant difference, not only to people's lives but also to the public purse. That's we're in a good position that we know that now. We just need to get on and do it and test it. So obviously, please do get in touch if you want to talk to us about probably piloting something and testing that and feeding back into what we know. So that's me. I don't think I've got time to talk about our campaign, so I'm gonna say thank you.
No, thank you, Faye. And that's a really good information there, and an awareness for all of us, I think, of what your organisation offers as well. And I think we need to pick up on that campaign thing as well. If you're joining in any of the breakout groups, there'll be an opportunity just to develop questions in this area. So interesting about the IPS model. And I've always believed as well that people want to work, and there's always that assumption that there isn't. And I know organisations on this, seminar workshop, a number of organisations will be putting energy and effort into employment and skills and helping people back. We do a lot of that at BCHA. Finding funding for it is always a challenge, like everything else, isn't it? Because you need to spend time, and so it's finding different ways of partnering, but it works, and there's some really good successes, isn't it, in that? And I think the other thing that stood out for me, and I'm sure a lot of local authorities, people who were working but had no recourse to public funds, and of course once COVID came along, and if they weren't furloughed, suddenly they can't pay the rent, and we've had had that increase in homelessness. So the sooner you can help people get back into work, you're into that prevention, aren't you? And I think that's an interesting model. Still left here, so we'll just quickly run around each group for maybe just 2 quick key points from the group. And so we'll start with Honey and then Catherine, who were looking at commitment 4 in 2 different groups. So 2 quick points from Honey and then 2 from Catherine would be ideal. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. And we had an interesting conversation, especially we had Gary as well in our room. So that was really, really useful. Thanks for the contribution. So obviously the main problem is we don't have enough homes. We all understand that, and no investor interest from the government as well. So, and the other thing is we thought there's no adequate support. These 2 models of what we're seeing in Plymouth, we probably need more of that lens across the national level. That probably would be a solution. The other thing we come across is around the knowledge and skills, because when you're supporting someone, you're looking at the one side of the support rather than the whole range of needs. So maybe we need to look at some trainings to make sure the person can provide full support. There's also some model East Devon Anne mentioned about as well. So it's about individualized system, and empowering the public facing workers could be one of the solutions.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really helpful. Catherine, anything from your group, please?
Morning, Martin. We actually joined Honey's group because there was only 2 of us in ours. So Alex and I both joined Honey's group.
Okay, yeah, okay, no, thanks then. So no, that's good. So commitment 5, meeting the needs of vulnerable tenant groups. That's Caroline and Colette. So
yeah,
you could go in that order, please.
Yeah, I could have spent an hour in that group. It was really interesting. So thanks for the contribution. We talked a lot about sort of past debts, arrears, you know, and people taking those issues with them, that they don't get left at a different accommodation, that it follows people around, and it's really a big hurdle for people to climb. Issues around accommodation just not being affordable. And we talked a little bit about how the benefit system feels somewhat broken and very difficult for people to be able to navigate. So that they were some of the key parts that we discussed. And then overcoming some of those barriers. Really, we talked a little bit about the housing first model, but the aspects of personalisation, so being able to hold people's hands through processes which are really difficult for them, and the importance of collaboration and being able to try things out, pilot things, new schemes, new ideas coming together. And although collaboration takes time up front and dedication and commitment, that it really reaps those rewards. And then what else can we do about lobbying? So, so where these systems are broken, how can we join our voices together to try and make some influence change?
Yeah, no, that's true. I think, yes, I think, lobbying is a key thing, isn't it? And feeding data and information and sharing those things so we can influence at all different levels is increasingly something that we need to do as a whole group of people, don't we? I think, definitely. So, yeah, Colette, anything from your group?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few things. Again, could have spent hours really discussing some really good conversations, so thank you. Really what we were saying is that people tend to not belong anywhere where they've got multiple needs and incredibly vulnerable, and yet they don't quite fit any of the, if you like, criteria or thresholds, and so are very excluded and incredibly have a huge amount of need and yet aren't able to access the services, and then are disadvantaged further because navigating the system is incredibly difficult. Not being able to get employment, not being able to use a tablet, all of the not being able to. We discussed the importance of having somebody to walk beside you, and yet you don't seem to have you don't seem to qualify to have anybody, but you'll need to have somebody walk by you and support you is probably greater at that point than ever before. And then we quickly went on to talk about those people who seem to have burnt their bridges with everyone, and are in that same situation. It's not being able to get into, but have had and are no longer able to access support and services. We tried to look at the solutions. We had about 30 seconds, and we thought we need to be much more creative and look at how we commission services differently, maybe.
Yes, thank you. Yes, no, I think, and I think, isn't it also those number of on this call would have been very much involved in the whole everyone in rough sleeper area, and we've seen so many good additional success stories about giving people those second, third, and fourth chances, and a lot of things have worked, haven't they? So I think that's right. Good, thank you. And commitment 6 about working in partnership to provide a range of affordable housing options. Nicola and then Vicky.
Hi, thanks, Martin. Yeah, we had a really great discussion, and like others, could have gone on for a lot longer. So we talked widely around the barriers to providing affordable housing, you know, from the sort of wider policy implications to down to the sort of nitty gritty of accessing housing, affordable housing. So a lot around the supply and demand, and the extremely high demand, which the group felt wasn't actually reflected truly in the numbers that are given. A lot of hidden homeless. We talked a little bit about ensuring accommodation, you know, when it is ready, it's actually ready to move into, rather than you know, giving to people without carpets or curtains or white goods, actually making it truly accessible for everyone. Rent in advance we talked about, and affordability, and the fact that actually a lot of affordable accommodation isn't necessarily affordable in the true sense of the word. Examples of alternative models, lots of ideas there. Particularly interested in BCH's offer of their garage sites in Plymouth, so we'll be talking to them about that. And we talked a bit about key partners needed in order to facilitate access to affordable housing, and the group felt that sort of joint commissioning and joint funding was very much fundamental to that. So that's sort of in summary.
Thank you. And to Vicky.
Yeah, we had a really great discussion too. We talked about how every building development of housing, element of housing that's truly affordable for people. So we talked about affordability. We talked about being flexible, so how bringing all partners together gives an opportunity to support people more flexibly. So if someone's been placed in accommodation, it's detrimental to their mental health or their physical health, looking at what we can do to support them into somewhere that is more appropriate. We talked about not getting held up on things like starter tenancies, so having a different conversation, giving people opportunity with a safe space, so that they have some stability and an opportunity to you know, address things like their mental health and their physical health.
Brilliant, thank you. So you know, we will capture some of these things, and that's really good discussion. And yeah, I think we'll have to find ways of having some slightly extended discussion time, won't we? Because clearly we've got a great group of people here who are willing to share in ideas, and maybe that's what we need to draw together more and more from the Southwest to feed into more national debates, as well as locally. There's plenty of influence that we need to do locally, isn't it? And those of us that are providers to work together to put solutions together to help influence what gets commissioned, rather than wait for things to be commissioned, and be a bit braver as advocates for all of our customers. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that you'll be interested in another event later this year, and so do feedback any ideas. You've got Vicky's email address, I think, Homes for Cathy. Any thoughts that you want to share, and then do send them back in, good or bad, as we learned from Gary. But all learning is good, and things that work and things don't work. I do believe that, actually, and I think too often we don't see it as learning. and we must get that sort of mentality. So just want to thank the BCHA team that have facilitated the breakout groups. Thank you very much. And to Richenda, who's our campaigns and comms manager, who liaises with Vicky a lot. Big thanks to Vicky from Homes for Cathy, who's put all this together and managed it so well. And very much very grateful to Faye, to Judith, and to Gary, who spent time with us and have stuck with us and put 3 very, very thought-provoking, interesting presentations that I'm sure we've all taken a few things away from each of those, and their willingness for us to contact them and engage with them, I says, just shows that the type of people they are that really want to help and to put a bit more time into helping all of us move forward and learn. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time and appreciate those of you that have put comments through. So have a good rest of the day, and let's keep trying to help more and more people have stable homes and lives where they can build their local communities. And as we heard from Faye, those that are able to work to find those jobs and move forward and be more and more independent with far more choice, like many of us are privileged to have. So thank you very much.